Okay, let's talk about snares. The past couple years, I've had the chance to check out a lot of really nice and then some not so nice snare drums, and I find myself evaluating them kind of on these 4 key principles or characteristics. And not even necessarily whether they're better or worse snares, but just, what does this snare do? Or where in your snare collection would this one fit? So the first thing I listen for is the quantity of overtones. And in this case, since snares we're not really looking for a primary pitch, I'm thinking of overtones as any frequency or harmonic that is discernible. So most people would describe this as ring, like how ringy is the snare versus how dry is the snare. So for example, I'll keep coming back to this ever popular Ludwig Acrolite. The Ludwig Acrolite is a fairly dry snare, not a lot of overtones, okay? And I'm not saying that this is necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. These are just the things I'm listening for when I'm checking out a snare. So that brings me to the second thing, which is what is the quality of those overtones? So if a snare is really ringy, are they nice sounding overtones? Are they pleasing to the ear? Or are they really harsh and aggressive? One thing I tend to dislike in snares is if it has a really specific frequency that you can hear. So if the overtones have a really distinct pitch, for me that makes it really hard to record the snare properly. Sometimes it works. Again, you might like that in a snare. Some situations might call for something like that. But again, these are just 4 characteristics to evaluate what a snare does, not to tell whether it's a better or worse snare. So again, the quality of the overtones. Does it have really distinct frequencies, or is it a collection of frequencies across the spectrum that makes it sound more like white noise? Maybe you have more lower overtones or undertones, right? Maybe you have more undertones and it makes the snare sound warmer, or maybe you have higher overtones and it makes it sound brighter, okay? So first 2, quantity of overtones, listen for how ringy is the snare, and then listen for what does that ring actually sound like. Is it a pleasing ring or is it harsh and aggressive? The third thing I'm looking for is the snare response. So this is often described as how sensitive is the drum, and this is kind of like, if I just tap it, how much snare response do I get? So the way this is tuned right now, I'm tapping it and I'm not hearing snares at all. So that's part of the characteristic of the drum. And there are many different things that determine this in a snare drum, from the snare beds to the way the wires are set up, tuning, etc. We're not going to talk about that today. That might be another video, is what characteristics of the snare actually affect these properties or these characteristics. But in this case, we're just talking about what to look for, what to listen for. So if you tap the snare really lightly, do you get snare response? So if you play a buzz roll, all the way out to the edge, are you still getting snare response all the way and even at your lowest dynamic? Okay, so that's the third one, is snare response. The fourth one is, what is the fourth one? The fourth thing I'm looking for is the tunability and then the fit and finish. So tunability, in my mind, is how easy is it to tune up this specific drum, and things like how round the drum is, what kind of hoops are on it, what kind of lugs are on it. These are all going to affect how easy it is to tune up, and this is assuming that you're comfortable with tuning to begin with. And if you are, then you've probably found that some snares just seem to take more work to get them in tune, and some of them, it almost seems like they tune themselves, like you can't tune them wrong. So tunability is one aspect of that, and then the other one is fit and finish. And this is more of an overall characteristic of, how does the drum feel? How smooth are the bearing edges? How well put together was it? Are there any blemishes or defects, right? How straight are the lugs? Do all of the tension rods align perfectly with the lugs? And the fit and finish of a drum can really be an indicator of, whether it's a premium drum or not. How well crafted is it? And it'll affect all of those other characteristics we talked about as well. Just to recap, I'm going to go through these 4 characteristics with the Ludwig Acrolite, one of my favorite snares. The first thing I'm listening for is the quantity of overtones, which in the case of the Acrolite is very low. There are very few overtones. It's a very dry snare. Then the second thing I'm listening for is, what do those overtones sound like? What is the quality of those overtones? And in the case of the Acrolite, they're very evenly spread out across the spectrum. So when you hit it, the overtones that you do hear sound more like white noise than like a specific frequency. The third thing I'm looking for is the snare response, which in the case of this drum right now, not very responsive, but that's probably my fault. I could readjust this. I haven't taken this one out in a while, and if I readjusted, I could probably get it to respond better. But in general, I know that the Acrolites aren't the most responsive, but they certainly don't, I wouldn't say they lack snare response. And the fourth thing I'm looking for is fit and finish, which with the Acrolites, the vintage models, can really be all over the board. Some of them were made really, really well and the quality control was good, and some of them are kind of janky, and over time they've been beaten up, you know, whatever. But the tunability, which was the other part of fit and finish, is, I think, pretty good. It's really easy, I find, to tune up an Acrolite because it's got self-aligning lugs. It's a dry shell, so you're not dealing with too many overtones to begin with. I really like it for that reason. I think it's easy to tune, few overtones, they're good sounding overtones, and then, you know, I got lucky. This one, as far as the fit and finish, is pretty well made. You know, your mileage may vary. But you can take those four characteristics and use them to evaluate any snare you are checking out or, you know, wanting to add to your collection. And yeah, just some things to think about. So, go forth, check out some snares, and I'll see you in the next one.